Hello, hello. This is Davis Center of Russian Studies of Harvard University. My name is Yevgenia Albats. I'm a senior fellow here, and today we have a very special guest. His name is Christo Grozev. Hi, Christo.
Hi, Evgenia. Great to see you again.
Christo Grozev is the main Bellingcat investigator. Bellingcat is an investigative journalist group which is doing its investigation based on open sources, predominantly open sources that they claim existed on the web. Christo Grozev in his previous life was a media manager and owner of radio station broadcasting in Bulgaria, he himself Bulgarian, and also of several, as far as I understand, several media businesses across Europe. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yeah, Bulgaria was a long time ago, but Europe, even until today, have some small shares in radio stations.
Okay, very nice. Christo, thank you very much for agreeing to speak at this Davis Center of Russian Studies, Russian and Eurasian Studies of Harvard seminar. So we're going to talk, to those who are totally novel to the subject. Let me tell you that Christo Grozev of Bellingcat did the major investigation that allowed to acknowledge the group of assassins who allegedly work for the Russian political police, the FSB. That's another incarnation of the infamous Soviet political police, the KGB. That's group of 8 who Russian internet labeled as disgusting 8. So according to an investigation that was produced by Christo and some other journalists from Der Spiegel, CNN, and Navalny himself, they made an attempt to kill Alexey Navalny, the leader of the Russian opposition, who was poisoned by a military nerve agent from the group of Novichok on August 20, 2020, in the Russian Siberian city Tomsk, which is some 4 hours of flight east of Moscow. This group of 7 operatives apparently was coordinated by the Colonel Stanislav Makshakov of the FSB Institute of Criminalistics. That was the one investigation which Alexey Navalny put into 2 clips, which already have been seen by more than 50 million viewers. Another investigation produced by Christo Grozev, which came out just last week, suggested that almost the same group of assassins, the same group of FSB assassins, killed 3 other people, 2 in the Russian Caucasus. One was a journalist, another one was a human rights activist. And the 3rd person was killed on the train, and he was a one-time Kremlin loyalist. Christo, is there a serial killer sitting in the FSB or in Kremlin?
Well, there is a serial killer sitting in Moscow. That's what we can say for sure. Whether the serial killer is technically at the FSB or in the Kremlin is up for debate. It's more of a philosophic question than a practical designation. But definitely there's a serial killer sitting in Moscow. And it's a serial killer that works on an industrial scale, that works with delegation, that works not with his own hands, but through taxpayers funded government entities and structures at a degree that hasn't been seen, in my personal view, since Stalin times. This is nothing comparable to, let's say, targeted assassinations, extraterritorial assassinations conducted in the past by intelligence services abroad of terrorists or even traitors. This is something that targets dissidents, that targets people that had not signed up to this rule of engagement, people that are not aware that they can be on any kill list. This is extrajudicial But more importantly, this is on an industrial scale. It is a structured killing machine. And therefore, calling it a serial killer is probably an understatement, because a serial killer would be limited to their own capability. And this is engaging the capability of a whole state.
How do you know that? Your investigation is based, as you say, on the open sources, though Vladimir Putin himself, president of the Russian Federation, didn't suggested that it wasn't you who conducted this investigation, but CIA and some other secret services existed in the West. But anyway, you claim that your data, that you use ticketing and billing information. How provable is this data? Why should we believe that the information regarding their travel and their communications are really related to these assassinations?
Well, first of all, of course, you have to work with a degree of probabilistics. You can't ever show the orders written by an FSB officer and signed by the president of Russia, kill this and kill that. So you have to create an assessment. And this is what any prosecutor around the world would do, any judge would do based on submissions of one side, one party and the other party. In this particular case, there's no investigation. There's no country in the world that wants to investigate this case. So we're, as an investigative team of volunteers and of open source researchers, we sit in the shoes of a non-existing prosecutor. So we have to look at the data not from individual degree of confidence in each part of the data point of view, but holistically. All of the data creates a picture. And in order for you to say this convincing data set of many, many different ingredients creates this picture, but it's not the truth, you have to have an alternative explanation, an alibi, so to speak. And in this case, nobody has been able to offer an alibi. But let me address your specific questions. How can we trust the data? First, let's look at the data source we use. We started as Bellingcat working only with open source data a couple of years ago. But then we started fighting against governments, or not fighting against, but investigating government crime. And government crime is very difficult to investigate with only open source data, because the governments are able to hide open source data. After our initial investigation of Russian military presence in eastern Ukraine that led to the shooting down of the Malaysian Boeing MH17 with 298 people aboard, a lot of that investigation was based purely on open source data. Russian soldiers leaving accidentally photographs with metadata on their social media accounts. But the Russian government instituted a ban on use of mobile phones in the army. And this is just one example how open source data became more difficult for us when we're investigating government-sponsored crime. In this particular case, we had to use more than open source data. So we used closed source data. That included travel data, ticketing data for the last 10 years of our suspects, and mobile phone data, including not only the listing, the logs of phone calls, but also the geolocation and the connection of each phone call to a particular base station. It's called the broadcasting tower at any given point of time. Now, this is data we get either from whistleblowers whenever we can, or from actual people working at mobile phone companies, or even low-level people working for the police, who are essentially selling this data without knowing to whom they're selling it through data brokers. And we can address the ethical aspect of this if you want later, but now we're talking about the veracity of the authenticity of the data. We make sure the data is authentic by applying very strict algorithms to how we work with data. First of all, we diversify the sources. None of the sources knows what we're working on. They only have compartmentalized view of a particular request, of one particular telephone number, or one particular travel record of a particular person, without knowing what context this is in. And each piece of data we request from several different, from at least two different sources, so that we can see that they match with each other. And a very important part of the algorithm is that we try to match each piece of current data with old data. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we were able to download a very comprehensive ticketing, air flight ticketing data of all Russian citizens from the period 2014 until 2017. It was leaked on the dark web. We were able to download it. This contains about 75 million tickets sold in that period. And when we get, for example, now in the context of the Navalny investigation, we acquire the ticketing data for a particular suspect of ours. We make sure that the data we get now is compliant with the data for that period, 2014, 2017, from the old data. Because even if somebody tries to manipulate data today, they can't go back in time and manipulate the data from 2017 that we've received. So this is just a number of examples of how we make sure that the data is not manipulated. Well, basically, that's the answer to why we believe in the data. The rest is, of course, how we convince our readers to believe in the data. In this particular case, we engaged, the findings we stumbled upon, which is that there's a machine, a government-run machine to kill people, were so implausible to me that I said we need to engage many international media with their own reputation so that we can convince the audience that this is not just a crazy guy or a crazy team, Bellingcat, manufacturing data. So we involved Der Spiegel, we involved CNN, we involved El País from Spain, and we involved our Russian traditional partner, The Insider, and we just gave this data to them and said, look at it, we won't tell you what we found, but look at these and these and these dates and tell us what you see. First. Second, validate the data yourself. Come reach your own conclusions about the authenticity of this data. And if you have any questions, ask us. So there was a week of these media organizations sitting down together, or sitting not all together, but some of them were together with us in the same room, browsing through hundreds of pages of records, scratching their head, and occasionally, well, cursing, because what they saw was so incredible. But this is just a sample of how we work with data and why we believe that everything we've concluded on is validated.
Great. What was the tipping point? So Alexey Navalny was allegedly poisoned in the hotel in Tomsk, and then he got on the plane, and 2 hours into the flight, he collapsed on the floor near the airplane's lavatory. The pilot of S-7 immediately landed in the city Tomsk, which is 2-hour flight from Tomsk, and so he landed there. The ER met the plane on the field. Navalny in the ER car was given a shot of atropine. So we believe that these two things have been, a lot of people who wrote about that believe that the pilot of the airline S-7, Russian airline S-7, and the air doctor basically saved Navalny's life. Then Navalny was rushed to the hospital in Tomsk. He was already in a coma. And so in 2 days, Putin allowed to transfer Navalny, to airlift Navalny to Germany. Just that's. So what was the tipping point for your investigation?
Well, I think there were several tipping points, because the first tipping point is where we had a strong working hypothesis that we found the killers, or the would-be killers, with the right motive, with the right means, and the right method. And this came when we found that 3 people who had traveled implausibly for a coincidental itinerary had traveled with Navalny on parallel flights, not on the same flight, but just before Navalny, to the city of Novosibirsk in eastern Russia. And then 5 days later, had purchased tickets back from Tomsk 1 day after Navalny to Moscow. So Yevgenia, you're Russian, so you can imagine the relatively implausible coincidence of somebody buying a ticket on the 13th of August to Novosibirsk, and then on the 21st of August from Tomsk overlapping with the planning of Alexey Navalny and his team. So this was our first strong hypothesis. But the tipping point actually came when we found that two of these three people that we found on these flights actually had a fake identity, and they traveled under names that didn't exist in real life. And the third one, who traveled under his real identity, we were able to find that in the past 5 years, he had flown next to Alexey Navalny on parallel flights a total of 11 times, most of them concentrated in 2011. Then the next step we stumbled upon was that on the same booking as this person, his name is Vladimir Panyaev, an FSB officer, there had been 6 other people who often flew with him at the same destination. And we identified that 2 of these had almost identical names and birth dates as the 2 fake identities that traveled with him to Tomsk. When we were able to get photographs of those people, both under the fake identities and the real identities, we saw that these are the same people. Then we expanded this universe of flights that we were able to compare to one another. We had Navalny flying to a number of Russian destinations since 2017 until his coma in 2020. And then we had these 7 people that we knew were somehow linked to one another because they flew often together. We compared those flights to Alexei's flights. We found a total of 37 overlapping flights. Anybody who has studied statistics and even hasn't completed the first statistics 101 would know that the probability of this being a coincidence it's almost negative. Yeah, it's close to 0. But it's an in-your-face implausibility. That was the main tipping point when we knew, okay, this is the team. There's no logic for this to not be the team. But then tipping points piled up after that. We found that of this team of 7 people, 4 were medical doctors, 2 were chemical weapon specialists, and 1 was a member of Russia's political police, which is the Department for Protection of Constitutional Order of the FSB. This is the equivalent to the Gestapo in contemporary Russia. It's a part of the FSB whose only goal is actually to protect and perpetuate the current regime, right, Yevgenia? I mean, that's the way I would describe it.
As it existed in the Soviet Union under the name Defeat Directorate, the currently it's a second service led by General Sedov. We're very well acquainted with the guy, yeah.
Right.
So lots of us, he created a lot of problems, yes.
So these people always flew together, and in about 10% of all of their flights over the last 5 years, they flew along with Alexey Navalny. And the first thing, of course, we always try to discard the innocent hypothesis, or to look at whether there's an innocent explanation. And of course, the innocent explanation in this case was, well, everybody knows Russia is a police state. Maybe these were just people tailing Navalny because they wanted to know what he's up to. So maybe it was pure surveillance. Wrong. That cannot be explained by a team of doctors and chemical weapons specialists, the same team always following him, which would be counter to any logic of surveillance, because in surveillance, you want to have different teams following up and changing and replacing. You've all seen the spy movies, so you know how it happens. And in surveillance, you always have them on the same flight, because otherwise you miss a significant part of the target you're surveilling. And in their case, they always flew on other flights, either behind or before him, to make sure that he's not, they're not identified. And a crucial finding that we had was that they never followed Alexey Navalny on a trip that he didn't have a hotel stay over. So if he would fly to a city for a day trip and come back in the evening, they would never buy a ticket for that. They would just ignore that. But on every single trip during the year 2017, and that's important because that was the year that he ran for president, or he wanted to run for president, but he was not allowed. On every single trip that he took where he had a stay over, they followed him. This also the fact that they didn't follow him on day trips runs against the innocent hypothesis that he was just being surveilled. And then crucially, and that was the last tipping point, when we found out that these doctors and chemical weapons specialists are talking by phone to a Russian institute called the Scientific Center Signal. It's the Signal Institute, which is staffed by 12 former experts or current experts in the former Chemical Weapons Military Institute number 33 of the Ministry of Defense, which in fact tested in the 70s, 80s, and 90s Novichok and 21 other chemical weapons. Now, there's no plausible innocent hypothesis why the team that tailed Navalny for a total of 37 flights, actually now the flight number has grown to 41 because we didn't know some identities when we published this. So on 41 different flights, medical doctors and chemical weapon specialists would be communicating with an institute that has only specialists in producing Novichok and other chemical weapons in the days and during the time that they were in Tomsk and Novosibirsk. Any court, any set of jury members, any prosecutor in the world would say, this is a convincing holistic case and the blame rests with these people. But the final straw, and I'll end here in terms of explaining our conviction of getting to the result, and the final tipping point was when we were able to finally get the phone records of one of the doctors on the team that followed Navalny. And we expected that he would not have switched on his phone on a mission like that. This was his personal phone, and he would use other methods of communication. But there's always an error, a margin for human error when we talk about people. And in this case, we were lucky to stumble across that error. And that was when this person turned on his phone for a single second. Apparently, the only explanation is to look at a number that he didn't know by heart. And the phone communicated with the base station only one byte of data. And this byte placed him about 20 minutes walk from the hotel where Alexey Navalny had just gone to bed that same evening, just before waking up and going to the airport and falling into a coma a couple of hours later. So this is a sequence of the tipping points. I'm sorry I didn't have a simple answer to you, Yevgenia.
It's very impressive. Thank you. What is, do I understand, is that correct to, that, the same group of assassins allegedly killed 3 other people in your latest investigation? Is it the same group?
Yes, it is the same group. I don't think, again, this is just analysis already, it's not based on knowledge, but I don't think the Kremlin or the FSB would entrust such a unlawful method of killing and the information about this unlawful, both from an international law perspective, but also from a Russian law perspective, operation to more than one team. So I think it's one team. But back to your question, what we saw in the actual 3 successful operations that we've been able to identify so far was presence of at least 2 members from this larger team at the location of the suspicious death by poisoning of all 3 cases. We believe that there are more members of this team that we haven't identified, or more different fake identities that we don't know yet. But the presence of at least 2 members of this team in all 3 cases is good enough for us to assign those suspicious deaths to this operation as well.
So there is a group of assassins who work out of the, who belong to the military intelligence group, who conduct assassinations outside Russia, and a group at those who conduct assassinations domestically. Is that right?
That is right. There's an overlap between the 2 groups, and the overlap is in the means and methods section. They both use often Novichok, not always. The FSB uses other poisons as well for less important targets, but I'm sure we'll get to that topic. But the means is the same. Both the GRU and the FSB get their Novichok from the Signal Institute. That's what we've been able to prove through monitoring the communication, the pattern of communication. Both the GRU kill team and the FSB kill team communicate with the Signal Institute scientists just before departing on an operation.
Just today, it became known that one of the doctors who was treating Alexey Navalny in Omsk all of a sudden dropped dead at the age of 55. His name is Sergei Maximishin. He was in charge of intensive care at the Omsk hospital, where Alexey Navalny was treated for 2 days. And according to, I have here Daily Mail, quote, a doctor who was in charge of treating Alexey Navalny in Russia soon after he was poisoned. Yes, so they suspect that he was also killed. What is your take on this? That's the doctor who dropped day to day.
If you had asked me this question 6 months ago, before this last investigation, I would say that coincidences happen and that it would be against the Kremlin's self-interest to conduct such an obvious assassination of somebody who would be immediately attributed, or a death that would be immediately attributed by the Daily Mail or by the global media to the Kremlin. But that was based on an instinct I had earlier to assess the probability of a crime having taken place. That factored into this algorithm of the instinct the cost of reputation, the reputation cost for the Kremlin. Since this investigation, and since what happened in the last 2 weeks with the protests in Moscow and the arrests of thousands of people, including journalists, I believe that the concept of reputation cost is completely ignored by the Kremlin. And therefore, I'm no longer, I wouldn't be surprised if this is what happened. We have seen that the team of the same poison team that we discussed traveled to Omsk, the place of the hospital, not only the immediate aftermath of the poisoning, for which we received an explanation through a confession by one of the poison team members, who said they were there to clean up the traces of the evidence in August and September. But we saw that members of this team traveled to Omsk in October and December of 2020. That would not make sense from the point of view of cleaning up traces anymore. So the question emerges whether there was a planned operation already to dispose of some of the witnesses. Now, again, this sounds crazy and not in the interest of the Kremlin, but I'm no longer convinced that the Kremlin is thinking of its own reputational interest anymore.
Thank you. There are suspicions that Navalny and his wife, Julia, were poisoned before and survived. Do you confirm?
I confirm the suspicion. I cannot confirm with the same degree of certainty that they were poisoned. What we have as evidence, very quickly, was that in a trip a month and a half before the final nearly lethal trip for Alexei, that was to the Russian town of Kaliningrad, he and his wife went there for a week of a romantic getaway. And we noticed that the same poisoners, the same team of FSB officers, flew to Kaliningrad just a couple of hours before Alexei and his wife were there. And they stayed there until the 4th day of their romantic getaway. And then they returned to Moscow on the 5th day. On the same day that they returned to Moscow, Yulia Navalny felt very, very similar symptoms to the symptoms of poisoning that Alexei had a month and a half later, except they were weaker, which could be explained, according to many chemical weapons specialists that we consulted, with her being accidentally exposed to a smaller dosage. Having found later the most likely method of application of the poison, which was through underwear or through underwear of Alexei Navalny, where the kill team was apparently able to access and place the poison, it could be that Yulia came in contact with poisoned underwear or clothes of Alexei Navalny, but that was for a short time and she was not exposed to a lethal dose of it. Again, what we have is the same team being there and a member of the family being experiencing serious symptoms of some sort of poisoning.
One of the developers of this military agent, nerve agent Novichok, told me that the poison, that their original, creation, their poison, was not meant to kill individual people, but, quote, something like a battalion at the battlefield. It was to be placed, that's Novichok, was to be placed in something like a grenade and thrown at the soldiers. Thus, and therefore, he said that obviously for the FSB assassin, for the alleged FSB assassins, it was quite difficult to define the exact dose suitable to poison to death. Therefore, assassins, he suspects that assassins were trying poison either on other people or even on Navalny himself in order to define the lethal dose. Do you buy this?
I cannot speak to that. What I do know from talking to many experts in chemical weapons, also from the former employees of the Organization for Protection of Chemical Weapons, is that Novichok indeed presents a problem when individually administered in the dosage, because if you apply too little, then the person will get away with just a discomfort. And this is linked to the fact that Novichok essentially affects your nerve connectors. And the body is like an internet, is able to reroute its nerve connections, even if 90%, almost 90% of the nerve connectors are broken. So if you misapply, if you have a low dosage, the person will notice, but will not really know that they're poisoned. And if you do it with an overdosage, with definitely sufficient dosage, the person may die immediately, which would link the crime to the perpetrators too easily. And furthermore, it is risking a blowback to the poisoner himself or herself. So finding the right dosage is very difficult. Therefore, a long-term testing process is a must-have. Whether they did it on animals, which is not possible properly, or on inmates, or on real targets, I cannot speak to that. But on somebody, they must have tested it.
Yes, Mirzayanov, one of the developers of the Novichok, claims that human touches were used when they were developing that poison during the Soviet times. However, of course, the question flies, Christo. Anna Politkovskaya was killed by a bullet. The same happened to Boris Nemtsov, who was killed, just 100 meters away from Kremlin. And Mark Kramer, whom you probably know, the director of the Davis Center's Cold War Studies Center, he asks the following. And in fact, I think he is right now in your home country. Why do the Kremlin authorities rely on poisoning? Sometimes the poison kills the target, but at other times it doesn't. When Ramzan Kadyrov wants someone killed, that's of course, Mark's suspicion, he orders his assassins to shoot the target, a technique that is almost always successful. Why does the Kremlin not rely on guns instead of poison?
Because of deniability. There's a requirement for deniability when you're dealing with high-level opposition figures or high-profile people in general. And one form of deniability is Ramzan Kadyrov, if you know what I mean. Until recently, my hypothesis on Nemtsov's likely and on Politkovskaya's likely motives has changed since I investigated the Navalny case. Earlier, I thought the most likely explanation is Russian power figures like Ramzan Kadyrov or even oligarchs are trying to deliver a present to the Kremlin that is probably not even desirable for the Kremlin, because the Kremlin could not benefit from such a disbalance of reputation cost versus getting rid of a nuisance like Nemtsov. But now I do think that's more likely that the Kadyrov avenue was just one of the ways to have a deniable assassination. Oh, sorry, it wasn't us. It was just some crazy Chechens. And in the same way, the deniability can be achieved through a successful poisoning by poison. What we see now is 3 cases that we believe we proved were based on an FSB assassination campaign, and nobody knew that was, in fact, well, there were a lot of suspicions, but nobody could prove that they were poisoned by the government. Everybody assumed, okay, natural causes, or maybe even a local enemy must have perpetrated it. So you see, it's similar. It's deniable, either when you do it through a way that you can always write it off as a natural cause, or through a bullet, but done in the hands of somebody who can say, that's not us.
Let me tell our audience, to those of you who may not know, Ramzan Kadyrov is the leader of Chechnya. His father was a famous sheikh in Chechnya at the time where in the 1990s, before the war. So, and he himself grew up basically among the guerrillas, with the guerrillas. And, when Putin became the president, he made peace with Chechnya. And Ramzan Kadyrov became the willing executioner of what Putin wanted from him.
The enforcer, let's call it the enforcer.
The enforcer, okay,
yeah.
Very good. Question from the audience, how did you identify the suspects?
Actually, it was by merging two ends of our investigation. One was tracking the poison and the other one was tracking the people. Tracking the poison means we followed the phone calls that were made by scientists from the signal center, because we had identified from another investigation on the GRU that these scientists manufactured the Novichok. So we noticed that they talked to some members from FSB, and then we parked that for a while because we didn't know where these members, what part of the FSB they belonged to. And then on the other hand, we went through the travel records of people that flew alongside Navalny. And long story short, we found an overlap between 6 people that both talked to the Signal Institute and traveled alongside Navalny. These 6 people became the core of our identification.
It's probably also, I believe you haven't mentioned it, that they never traveled together with Navalny, correct?
No.
There were those who conducted surveillance, obviously, but, those assassins who you identified, they never traveled on the same airplane with Navalny. Is that right?
No, they never did. They never did. We had a hypothesis that that's because they don't want to ever be seen over a long term of tracking him. But this was actually confirmed in a phone call that Yevgenia, we haven't mentioned, but Alexey Navalny called one of his own poisoners after we presented him with our findings in a prank call, and he was able to get him to talk for 50 minutes under the pretense of reporting to an upper security official of the failed operation on Navalny himself. And this person actually explained in that 50-minute call that they never traveled along with Navalny in order exactly to never be noticed.
Right. It was my next question. For those of you who are interested, you can go on Navalny.com and you can watch this conversation. It is in the second clip. So first, Navalny put out an investigation that was done by Christo and others. And then after the first clip came out, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, had a presser, and he was asked about this investigation. He said that, of course, it's all BS, and, there is nothing, real in this, and, who cares about Navalny, and he never mentions Navalny, of course, but by his name. Who cares about he? He said, who is he to deal with? And, if we wanted to poison, to kill, we would definitely get the job done, said the president of the Russian Federation, correct?
That is correct. Let me just correct one thing, because actually in that presser, he did validate a big part of our investigation. He said, yeah, I know about that investigation. And yes, there were these FSB officers trailing him. But of course, he's a spy. He's an enemy of the state. And therefore, of course, he should expect to be surveilled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. So Vladimir Putin made that statement on Thursday, and next Monday, correct? Navalny put out another clip, and in that clip, Navalny pretended to be an assistant to General Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's pal from the KGB, and now, the head of the Russian Security Council, one of those, hardliners in the current Kremlin. So Navalny pretended to be his assistant, and he said that he's preparing a report for Mr. Patrushev, and he has to do it very, very quickly. It was early in the morning. So he started asking these operative questions, and this operative, he's a cleaner, right? Чистильщик, he acknowledged that, what, already Christo said, and he also said that, apparently poison was poured in the cod piece of Navalny's underwear. So that was, a great piece of investigation that came out that, of course, made Kremlin it was obviously, you could feel it. Kremlin was stunned. Another question, do you agree with the claim that Russian security agencies represent an independent political group that can seize control over political decisions? Do you want to answer the question, Christo?
I'll give my answer, but I think yours is probably more qualified. I think they can become one. They're not one now. I think there are mechanisms to introduced by Putin to minimize that risk by having, for example, access to chemical weapons and access to explosives of a large scale, being subject to two signatures from two different agencies, one from the FSB, one from the FSO, which is the Secret Service under the direct control of Putin. And as of now, I think the Siloviks, the intelligence services, are complying with this. This can change, however, I think, when Putin becomes too much of a hot potato for the elite, and the elite is able to convince some of the security top brass to change sides. That's just my impression. Yevgenia, I'll yield to you.
I really think that, it's already all happened, and the Russia's run, it's a corporate state, and it's run by the corporation of the graduates of the KGB. So, and there are, of course, some civilians, and whose duty is to write economy on a day-to-day basis. These kind of regimes are very well known in political science, especially in Latin America. They're called bureaucratic, military, authoritarian regimes. So, but anyway, here is another question about this Navalny's prank call. Did you, the investigators, have any expectation beforehand about what you would be able to extract in the phone call, or was it a shot in the dark? Did you have any appreciation about the chance of success of one of the prank calls?
Yes, I thought the chance was zero, literally zero. The plan was completely different. The plan was for Alexei to confront his would-be killers and to tell them literally, "Hi, my name is Alexey Navalny. You may remember me from the time you tried to kill me. Why did you do that?" That was actually the plan. And I thought it was just a moral requirement and right for him to do it. He himself changed the script in the middle of the calls to the prank call. He did it on two people. The first one reacted exactly as I imagined it would happen. He said, "No, you're not an aide to Patrushev. I know exactly who you are." And he hung up. And the second one, totally unexpected. The first 3 minutes, I thought that this person was even playing a game and trying to just keep Navalny going for whatever reason. I even expected some Russian FSB to show up in the room where we were in Germany and bring down the door. But then the breaking point was when this same officer gave new information that we didn't even have before. And then I knew this is for real. This guy really thinks he's talking to the aide to the boss.
And this new information related to the fact that he was cleaning the cod piece and the poison was put there. That's right?
That's one. And the second one was he gave names that we didn't know about. He gave the name of the local FSB officer from the Constitutional Protection Unit in Omsk, who was actually stealing Navalny's clothes from the hospital and taking them to him for cleaning. So this was a new piece of information we didn't have. But more importantly, he validated our own interpretation of why Navalny survived. Because one of the questions Alexei Navalny asked him was, "Why did you fail?" And then he said, "Circumstances. The pilot landed the plane too early, and the paramedics on the landing strip accidentally gave him the right treatment. So these two negative developments made it not work in our favor." This was the first time I was hearing somebody talk about prevention of death as negative developments.
What is the job description in this disgusting aid? Do you understand
I think
who
I
was,
do.
are there, some specific person who did put the poison in the hotel, in tongs, in Navalny's underwear?
Based on the overlap of people over different poisoning attempts, we can be sure that the crucial people are Alexey Alexandrov and Ivan Osipov, medical doctors who have worked in this unit since 2010, so more than 10 years now. And one of them even earlier, from 2007. I think I have a vague understanding of how they were able to change from medical doctors treating people to killers. And it's kind of a typical slow boiling the frog phenomenon. Initially, they were given targets that looked legitimate to them. They were given targets of legitimate terrorists during the second Chechen war. There were terrorist attacks in the aftermath of that on Russian citizens, and they were sent to assassinate terrorists. And then slowly over time, this went through a hypertrophy of the whole institute of this killing machine, with more and more personal corporate interests being added to the legitimate targets. And I think these guys just missed the moment when they became killers for hire for President Putin.
Thank you. We cannot avoid this question, but and that's the question: who ordered the killing or attempt on life of the leader of the Russian opposition? And just before, when I was preparing for this conversation and writing something as well, I was going through the handwritten minutes that was written by Pavel Sudoplatov, the chief assassin in the Stalinist time, one of those who was preparing the assassination of Lev Trotsky, along with his deputy Eitingon, and who was involved in several other assassinations, including one of the American citizen organs back in the post-war time. So that's the letter when when Khrushchev, succeeded, became the leader of the country. Sudoplatov, as some other Stalin's henchmen were put in jail, was sentenced to 15 years in jail. He spent 13 years in jail, and he was released. And by the end of his life, he was pretty much rehabilitated. But what's important about these memoirs is that, and the reason why I was returning back to reading all these very interesting documents, that Sudoplatov writes about people who gave him orders, and almost in each and every case, the order to kill this or another person was given either by Stalin himself, the leader of the then Soviet Union, or by Molotov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and then the Chief of Government, or by two of them. So it is to say that in each and every case, there was the leader of the state, of the Soviet state, who gave the order. When I spoke to several of my sources from the KGB, they kept telling me that in each case when KGB was involved in any assassinations, later, after Stalin died, there was the general secretary of the Communist Party, and we know that Khrushchev himself ordered the assassination of Bandera and then another person. Anyway, that it was, the leader of the country who gave this order, because only the leader of the country was able to provide some sort of guarantee to the executioner, to enforcer, absolutely, as you like to put it. So given that, do you think that Putin himself President of the Russian Federation himself gave an order to kill Navalny?
I can, for myself, I can bet my own lifetime reputation on the fact that he approved it. I don't know if he initiated the idea or Patrushev or somebody came and said, I have a great idea. Let's kill him so that nobody knows. I'm absolutely sure that Putin approved it for the same reasons that you, by parallel, gave as an example from Soviet times, but also for another reason. Both Stalin and Putin are paranoid about their own circle and about their power, clinging to power, and therefore giving a tool, an extrajudicial tool with some degree of self-sufficiency, poisoners, to others to decide who is a target, that runs against this paranoia. He would never allow for this unit to decide on its own who to poison. He would never allow them to get the actual poison for this particular operation without his own signature. Just because if he didn't do that, if he didn't have control over that, one day he might be on the receiving end. So all of these make it impossible, absolutely impossible, that Putin did not approve every single operation. The question is, can he manage so many approvals? Our estimate based on travel data is that these people kill or try to kill about 8 to 10 people per year. So yes, he can manage that.
Thank you. It was very smart explanation. Christo, do you worry that transparency, that's the question from the audience, about your data methods, which helps build and strengthen your case and will make it easier for the future bad actors to cover their tracks?
Absolutely. And that was a very, very big dilemma we had to address before publishing this investigation. The end result was we concluded that the public interest in understanding and believing this data overweighs our own ability to continue to work. And we realized, and we already experienced difficulties in continuing our investigations. But I think this was the tipping point where we had to actually say enough is enough and convince the world that this is what's happening in a contemporary country.
What do you expect going forward? Now that Bellingcat has publicized these findings, will the Kremlin continue to rely on Novichok and the specific assassins? And what's going to happen to those assassins?
I don't think they will be killed, if that's the sort of undertone of the question. Unlike Stalin times, in today's Russia, we haven't seen actually killings due to mistakes. We've seen killings due to betrayal, but not to mistakes. So I think they will be punished by being sent to do a desk job in an uninteresting part of Russia. But I don't think they will be incarcerated or killed. The question is, can they replace them with somebody else soon enough? And I think the value of our transparent investigation is that I cannot imagine anyone, any doctor, now accepting the job offer and believing, this can be kept secret forever. I think the deterrent effect of our investigation will make it very difficult for the Kremlin to re-employ people for the next 10 years.
Christo, thank you so much. It's so promising, you know. I feel real better returning back home. Does Christo have any hypothesis about how the FSB poisoner could be fooled so easily during the prank call?
Yes. If you speak Russian, you would probably find it easier to believe than if you don't, because Alexey Navalny is probably the best actor I've ever heard in my life. He was able to impersonate not only the speech pattern, not only the vocabulary of the militarized system of the FSB, but also their bullying method. And basically his speech was peppered with a parasitic phrase like, you know what the boss is expecting, you know what, that before 8 I need to deliver, or you know what will happen to me. And this guy felt sympathetic to this guy, to Alexei, who was, in his view, the aide to the boss. And he was also bullied. So he was both felt bullied and sympathetic at the same time. And it was this pressure, time pressure, I need this before 8 or we're both in trouble, that actually worked. Again, I don't have a full explanation because myself, I was so shocked that it did work. But Alexei was improbably an amazing actor that morning.
Right, but it also very well describes the the psychology of the members of the Russian bureaucracy. Somebody from the big boss, assistant to big boss, to the general, from the called and asked him question. He probably felt even empowered by that Patrushev himself wanted information from him.
Let me add to that. You're absolutely right, Evgenia, and I forgot this is an important thing. The Alexei character called and said, I'm calling you first before I call even your boss, because I got a good word about you from the top guy. And he was like, he knows me in person? And Alexei said, yes, Bogdanov knows you in person. So this worked. And I think also, probably he wasn't too intelligent, this chemical weapons specialist, because he asked on an open line, but is it acceptable for us to talk on an open line? And then on an open line, Alexei told him, oh, yes, it is acceptable to talk on an open line. So this vicious circle didn't actually strike him as any possible conversation.
Exactly. And that's another something that tells us about the Russian bureaucracy. Protocol, rules, norms, they're much less important than the hierarchy,
Exactly.
than the call from some bossy person. Right. This is very interesting. I mean, for anyone who is going to do Russian bureaucracy, this is amazing.
Or anybody who wants to do a psychology case study or a PhD, I think this call is amazing.
Finally, we left just, with 2 minutes, and I have to ask you this question. You mentioned this, to which extent it was ethical to pay money for the information that you were obtaining through on the dark internet. Yes, in many, in the European journalists, it's pretty much allowed. Journalists in much of Europe and much of Western Europe, in Italy, in France, even sometimes in Great Britain, they do pay, especially those in tabloids, they do pay for information. However, across the Atlantic in the United States, the line of thought is the following. If you pay for the information, then somebody who is providing you information will feed you with frenzy just because he or she wants to get your money. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many reasons not to. The one that you gave as an example does not apply in this case, because the people who are selling this information, they don't know why they're providing this information. They don't know the topic of the information. They don't even know the subject. They don't know the names on which they're providing information. And they're just in the trading business of information, so that they're just making a buck. So it's only a question of whether we want to accept that information, that ethical bargain. And it's just a matter of public interest. This same information would be easily acceptable without any money to the investigative authorities in Russia if they wanted to investigate this crime. Clearly, they're not going to investigate a crime of their own president. So that is not an option. What is the other alternative for a foreign government to investigate? Nobody wants to do that because nobody wants to cross the border of national sovereignty. So Germany doesn't want to investigate a crime that happened in Russia. We're left filling in the shoes of investigators. We don't have access to cross-border databases. We have to buy that data, and we do.
And we should, of course, say that Russian government, Russian law, so-called law enforcement agencies refused even initiate the criminal case on the suspected attempt on Alexey Navalny's life. This is a telling fact. Why Navalny came back to Russia if he knew he would be arrested?
I asked him that back in November, and he was already then determined to come back in the middle of January. And he explained it simply, I know I can be arrested. I suspect I might be killed. But if I stay here, I will never be able to contribute to Russia. I will never be able to be a politician because I will be written off within a couple of months as one of the many emigres, like Yevgenia, who went to live a normal life abroad. Yeah. And he wanted to be a politician, not a journalist. And I think that's a difference. And he needs to be where his potential electorate is. And yeah, the unique thing about him is he's willing to pay the price of staying in jail for a year or two, just knowing that one day he'll be out, hopefully, and will be able to continue his work. Not many can do that.
I should correct you, Christo. Yevgenia never immigrated. Yevgenia went to the United States to teach because I was unable to make any money in Russia anymore. So that allowed me to pay some salaries on my website, The New Times. And early March, I'm returning back to Russia. Just to make sure.
That's because I told you that those guys are without a job, right?
Are you afraid that Navalny is going to get killed in jail?
I am afraid. I really am afraid. That's a function of this newly found observation that there's no reputation cost that the Kremlin is not willing to pay. I think they may do something even worse. They might actually torture him or just try to create a mental breakdown for him in jail, which in some cases may be even worse than death. So yes, I do not exclude that at all.
Once again, in the Soviet past, there were cases like that. One of them was, there was a dissident Morozov who was tricked by the KGB, who basically disclosed some names. People were arrested. Morozov hanged himself in the cell. There was another case of the famous dissident Marchenko, who went on the hunger strike and died in jail. What can be done? Realistically speaking, what kind of pressure should be executed? What can we do in order to get Navalny out?
Well, now we have to change our hats from journalists and investigators to actual citizens and activists. So that is just my personal opinion, but I think this is a quantum difference between everything we've seen before. We are seeing a structured killing machine, and it's not enough for governments to express concern, as has happened so far. It is time to treat the Russian government, at least temporarily, no different than the government of North Korea. It is a terrorist government, and it has to be treated as one by everybody. And our citizen role as non-government officials is to actually explain to the passive part of the population that is not following the news that this is happening, and it's a different Russia than the Russia we wanted to be friends with even 15 years ago.
In one of the interviews, you, Christo, said that this was your last investigation. Are you fearful for your life?
Yes, I am fearful for my life. Again, I don't think they will act soon or quickly, but we see that they take their time. We saw it with Skripal. But this is not something that I can just stop halfway in the midstream. So I have to continue at least this vector of investigations. Who else did these people try to kill? And who else did they actually kill? So this I see as one long investigation. It will probably take the rest of this year for me.
For the audience, I should say that Christo Grozev put his data on the web. So any of you who would like to check these data or help to find others who were assassinated or else, you can find these on the web. Just Google Christo Grozev data, and you will be able to do it yourself. Christo, probably this is the very last question because our time up. What kind of sanctions do you expect from the Western countries as a response to the attempt to kill Alexey Navalny?
I expect that the institutes that we identified as actually manufacturing Novichok these days should be sanctioned. I expect that the actual full listing of employees of the Institute of Criminalistics should be sanctioned, but that is not going to work for changing the system. I think what can work is what Alexey Navalny himself has suggested, going after close allies of President Putin, close friends of President Putin, who keep his money, and making them feel like he's the hot potato for them, and making change from within by actually people stopping to be proxies for President Putin.
Do you believe that Western governments will do this?
I do.
We're talking about billionaires.
I do believe.
Okay. I love your optimism. Let's hope that our next interview with you will be, about something, about outcomes of your investigation, and there will be. We will talk about flowers. Do you like flowers, Christo?
Well, I've spent most of my business time in the Netherlands, and yes, we have a lot of flowers there.
Okay, great. This was Christo Grozev, the main investigator of the Bellingcat. I'm grateful to you, Christo, for taking part in this conversation. I'm grateful to the organizers of this event, to Chris, to Penelope, to everybody, to Daniel, and to the executive director of the Davis Center of Russian and Eurasian Studies, Alexander Vakvro, for allowing me to run that seminar. Thank you so much, and let's God help us. Goodbye.